Kilburn Drive in Wigan was quiet. Just another cold Thursday evening. Minutes later, that silence was broken. A single event turned a suburban street into a scene of chaos. What started years earlier with a swipe on a dating app had now spiraled into something dark. A plan so precise that even experienced detectives would call it one of the most shocking cases they'd ever faced. This is the story of a Tinder date that would set off one of Britain's most shocking murders, and how a chilling plot was finally uncovered. On Kilburn Drive in Shevington, Wigan, the night was calm. The kind of winter evening where the streets are empty and windows glow with the soft light of families settling in. But then something broke that quiet. A neighbor spotted something at the bottom of a driveway, a shape lying still on the ground. At first, they weren't sure what they were looking at. Within minutes, emergency services swarmed the scene. Police sealed off the road as fire crews and paramedics tried to assess what they were dealing with. They feared there was a chemical hazard. Officers in hazmat suits moved in, working under floodlights. It was only when the scene was examined up close that the reality became clear. The man lying there was 38-year-old Liam Smith. He had been shot in the face. After that, chemicals, in an attempt to destroy evidence. Detectives later described the scene as unlike anything they had seen before. The combination of gunshot wounds, corrosive substances, and the deliberate effort to degrade the body told them this was no random attack. This was something planned, cold, and calculated. But the question in those first hours was simple. Who would want to kill Liam Smith? He wasn't known to police. He had no enemies. By midnight, Greater Manchester Police's major incident team had launched a murder inquiry, but they were starting with almost nothing. No witnesses, no clear motive, only a brutal crime scene and the haunting smell of chemicals in the air. Liam Smith's name quickly spread across headlines, but behind the crime scene was a man whose life looked nothing like the violent end he met. At 38, Liam was a father of 2 young boys, a devoted dad who, according to his family, would do anything for those he loved. Friends described him as generous, the kind of man who would give the shirt off his back without a second thought. He lived in Shevington, Wigan, where he ran his own business, LPS Electrical and Build Limited, a small company that kept him busy but allowed him to provide for his family. His past included service as a soldier, a chapter that those close to him said had shaped his strong but quiet character. In the days after his death, tributes poured in. Flowers and cards appeared along Kilburn Drive, neighbors leaving messages about a man they called kind-hearted and dependable. His sister Gemma spoke of him as her rock, someone who had always been there, no matter what. There was no hint of the kind of life that attracts violence. Liam had no criminal connections or enemies. He was simply a father, a brother, and a friend who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or so it seemed at first, but as detectives began to dig into his past, a single name emerged. Rachel Fulstow, a woman Liam had met briefly in 2019 through a dating app. A single encounter long forgotten by Liam, but one that would become the root of a deadly chain of events. For investigators, it raised the first question that mattered. Could something that happened years ago have come back to destroy his life? In 2019, Liam Smith and Rachel Fulstow crossed paths in what seemed like a chance connection. They matched on Tinder and agreed to meet in York. The date appeared unremarkable. Dinner, drinks, and later a hotel room. For Liam, it was just another night. He moved on with his life, never knowing that this brief encounter would resurface years later in the worst possible way. Rachel, however, would later claim that what happened that night wasn't consensual. She didn't describe it as rape, and she never reported it to the police. In fact, the following day she had lunch with Liam before heading home. Nothing in that moment suggested that their meeting would one day be twisted into the motive for a killing. 2 years later, Rachel Forstow's life was entangled with Michael Hillier, a man with a dangerous reputation. Hillier, from Sheffield, was a drug dealer who prided himself on staying under the radar. He knew about burner phones, cloned number plates, and how to make evidence vanish. To the outside world, he played the part of a flashy but successful man. Expensive cars, a confident presence, and a tough exterior. But behind closed doors, he was volatile and controlling. Rachel, who had previously worked for luxury hotel chains, found herself drawn into his world. What began as a relationship quickly became a toxic mix of jealousy and manipulation. Hillier's obsession deepened when Rachel told him about her one-night encounter with Liam Smith. Whether it was guilt, fear of losing Hillier, or something else entirely, Rachel's account fed his anger. He convinced himself that Liam needed to be punished. But this wasn't just about revenge for a past encounter. Hillier's ego, his need to dominate, began to twist the narrative. He saw himself as someone who could take matters into his own hands, a dangerous belief that Rachel neither stopped nor openly encouraged. What detectives would later piece together is that their relationship laid the groundwork for something unthinkable. Hillier's influence was growing. Rachel's silence, whether out of fear, loyalty, or manipulation, allowed that influence to take hold. This was the turning point. What started as a troubled relationship was about to evolve into something far worse, a partnership that would soon be tied to one of the most shocking crimes Britain had seen in years. The decision to kill Liam Smith was not made overnight. The plot against Liam Smith began quietly, months before the night of the murder. Detectives later uncovered that the preparation started as early as May 2022. From that point on, Michael Hillier and Rachel Forstow's actions revealed a disturbing level of detail and patience. Rachel's involvement was subtle but essential. She began by researching Liam online, not just his business, LPS Electrical and Build Limited, but also his personal life and home address. She combed through search results, and her digital footprint revealed chilling queries like, "What is premeditated?" and "How long does it take for a car to burn completely?" She also scouted Mitsubishi Shogun models, the same vehicle Hillier would later use, and checked the weather forecast for Wigan on the day of the planned attack. Hillier, meanwhile, prepared with a precision that alarmed detectives once they pieced it together. He sourced blank-firing guns and modified them to fire live ammunition. He trained in his Sheffield cellar, firing at makeshift targets to improve his accuracy. He also purchased corrosive chemicals, sulfuric acid and soda crystals, with the intention of destroying evidence and making the crime scene unrecognizable. By early November, their plan had shifted into action. On 2nd of November 2022, Hillier made his first trip from Sheffield to Wigan. This wasn't to strike, but to carry out hostile reconnaissance. He sat in his Mitsubishi Shogun, a vehicle already fitted with cloned plates, and watched Liam's home for hours. CCTV later showed Hillier's vehicle parked nearby, almost blending into the quiet neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, the couple fine-tuned their plan. He secured the weapons, the chemicals, and the false plates, one of which read as R22ORA, a plate that would later become a critical clue in the investigation. This was no random act of violence. Every move was calculated. Hillier and Forstow were waiting for the perfect moment, a night when Liam would be home, alone and vulnerable. By the 24th of November, everything was ready. The plan was set in motion. Michael Hillier left Sheffield early. His Mitsubishi Shogun fitted with the same cloned R22 plates. By mid-morning, he was parked on Kilburn Drive in Shevington, positioned so he could see Liam Smith's house but remain unnoticed. He brought with him everything needed for the attack: a modified blank firing gun, sulfuric acid, soda crystals, and high-vis clothing to make him look like a workman. For 10 hours, Hillier waited. Neighbors later recalled seeing the vehicle but thought nothing of it. CCTV from a nearby property would later capture glimpses of Hillier stepping out of the car, adjusting his high-vis jacket, and pacing as he rehearsed what was about to happen. As evening fell, Hillier prepared to strike. Just after 6:30 p.m., he walked up to Liam's house wearing a head torch, a detail meant to draw Liam outside under the guise of a work-related issue. Moments later, Liam stepped out of his home. What happened next was captured only by sound: a single gunshot, heard on nearby CCTV audio, which would prove fatal. Hillier fired at close range, hitting him in the face. Liam collapsed just outside his driveway. But Hillier wasn't finished. He drove around the block before returning to the scene. From the back of his shotgun, he retrieved bottles of corrosive chemicals. He poured sulfuric acid and soda crystals over Liam's body. A brutal act designed to destroy forensic evidence and leave a scene so disturbing it would confuse investigators. Within minutes, Hillier was gone. He abandoned the shotgun later that night, burning it to destroy any trace of his involvement. For the community of Kilburn Drive, the events of that evening were shocking. The quiet street suddenly became a crime scene, with emergency services arriving to find Liam's body surrounded by white residue and chemical fumes. Detectives quickly realized this was no random killing. It was premeditated, precise, and unlike anything they had encountered in years. In the hours after Liam Smith's murder, Michael Hillier drove back to Yorkshire, leaving behind a scene of chaos on Kilburn Drive. His Mitsubishi Shogun, now a key piece of evidence, was later burned out. The cloned R22 Ore plates destroyed along with it too. He wanted every trace of his presence wiped clean. Rachel Fulstow played her part, carefully crafting alibis. While Hillier carried out the attack, she kept her digital activity quiet, knowing police would look at phone data. But her earlier searches, weather forecasts in Wigan, information on burning vehicles, and details about Liam's business, were already saved. Days after the murder, instead of lying low, the couple acted as if nothing had happened. They boarded a flight to Jamaica, beginning a 2-week holiday in the Caribbean. Photos later recovered by detectives showed them riding horses in the sea, smiling as if the events of Kilburn Drive had never taken place. For investigators, this was a crucial detail. While Greater Manchester Police were piecing together the puzzle of Liam's death, Hillier and Fulstow were thousands of miles away, enjoying cocktails and sunsets. Their lack of remorse and the arrogance of believing they could escape justice would later become a central theme in court. Back in the UK, officers combed through hundreds of hours of CCTV, looking for anything unusual around Kilburn Drive on the 24th of November 2022. That's when they spotted the Mitsubishi Shogun. It had been parked in the area for nearly 10 hours, barely moving, and then leaving the scene soon after the attack. Detectives issued an appeal for information about the vehicle, and every detail about it became critical, including its false registration, R22ORA. The breakthrough came when South Yorkshire Police reported that they had stopped this exact vehicle weeks earlier, and Michael Hillier was behind the wheel. This discovery immediately put Hillier on the radar. From that moment, the case began to fall into place. Further checks on Hillier's background revealed his involvement in large-scale cannabis production and a history of staying off the grid, using burner phones and other tactics to avoid police attention. But even he had left a digital trail. Phone records placed him in Wigan on the day of the murder. When the couple returned from Jamaica, the walls were closing in. Hillier was arrested in January 2023. Fulstow, initially treated as a witness, lied repeatedly during interviews. More damning evidence emerged when detectives examined Rachel Forstow's online activity. Her searches for Liam's business and for all of the activity we already discussed. This made it clear she wasn't just an innocent bystander. Police pieced together that she had helped Hillier plan the murder, feeding him the information needed to find Liam. By February, she too was under arrest. The cover-up had failed. The meticulous planning that Hillier and Forstow believed would protect them had instead left behind a trail of evidence that detectives would use to bring them both down. For Liam Smith's family, the night of 24th of November 2022 shattered everything. In the days that followed, their quiet street became a crime scene, filled with flashing lights, forensic tents, and news crews. But behind the headlines was a family struggling to comprehend how their son, brother, and father could have been taken from them in such a brutal way. Liam's parents, Julia and Phil Smith, made public appeals for information as the investigation unfolded. At a press conference, Julia broke down while pleading for anyone with knowledge of her son's murder to come forward. Phil, his voice shaking, described the killing as savage and senseless, saying the family was haunted by the manner of his death. 2 young boys were left without their father, a man who had been at the center of their world. Friends and neighbors spoke of how devoted Liam was to his children, always working to provide for them, always present in their lives. 2 young boys will now have to spend the rest of their lives without their adoring father, his words echoing the raw pain of a family torn apart. As the weeks turned into months, the family's grief deepened, compounded by the horrific details that emerged about how Liam had been killed. The calculated cruelty of it all was impossible to reconcile with the man they knew, a father, a son, a brother who simply lived a quiet life and worked hard for his family. For Liam's family, justice would never bring him back. But as they sat through the trial months later, they clung to the hope that the truth, however painful, would at least ensure that those responsible for his death would never harm anyone else. On 20th of July 2023, the trial of Michael Hillier and Rachel Forstow began at Minshall Street Crown Court in Manchester. The courtroom was packed with journalists, family members and officers who had spent months piecing together the brutal events of 24th of November 2022. The prosecution, led by Jason Pitter KC, laid out a case of premeditated murder driven by what he described as vigilante justice. He told jurors how Michael Hillier and Rachel Forstow had carefully plotted Liam Smith's killing for months. The defense attempted to challenge the narrative. Hillier admitted manslaughter, but denied murder, claiming he acted out of a misguided sense of justice after Forstow told him Liam had non-consensual sex with her during their Tinder date in 2019. He insisted it was a crime of passion, not a calculated plan. Forstow, on the other hand, denied all involvement, insisting she had no knowledge of the attack and that Hillier acted alone. But the prosecution's evidence, her searches, and other evidence left the jury unconvinced. After a trial that lasted 6 weeks, the jury delivered unanimous guilty verdicts. On 25th of August 2023, sentencing took place. Michael Hillier, 39 from Sheffield, was given life imprisonment with a minimum term of 33 years. Rachel Forstow, 37 from York, was also sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. As the sentences were read out, Liam Smith's family wept in court. Months of waiting for justice had come to an end. What do you think about this case and the sentences? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more real UK crime stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's always another case to uncover. It started with a smile, a couple once pictured on yachts, sipping cocktails under the Mexican sun. Days later, a body found in a Manchester townhouse, tortured and the walls painted red, No signs of forced entry, no obvious motive, just one woman who knew too much, and a séance that changed everything. This is the story of Thomas and Colleen Campbell, and how a secret world came crashing down. They looked like the kind of couple who had made it. Matching blacked-out cars on the drive, a freshly built home extension with mosaic floors and a private gym in the garden. Designer clothes, luxury watches, and holidays most families only dream of. In public, Thomas Campbell was a personal trainer. Colleen worked part-time at Matalan. They were often seen taking their kids to school, showing off sun-soaked photos from Cancun, Mallorca, and Sharm el-Sheikh. One trip alone cost £10,000 in cash. But the truth was buried deep in cash. Dirty cash, the kind that doesn't go near banks. Between 2012 and 2016, they funneled drug money through car finance agreements and property upgrades. Flash vehicles, BMWs, Audis, and a 6.3-litre Mercedes AMG all were registered to their names. Both sides of the family were involved: parents, siblings, and cousins, all part of a low-key criminal web designed to hide wealth in plain sight. By 2018, it caught up with them. A joint police operation led to both being charged with concealing criminal property. Colleen avoided prison. Thomas didn't. He served 2 years. When he came out, the marriage was finished. She stayed in the house. He moved on. New partner, new routines, same old secrets. But something had shifted. What was once a united front had fractured into bitterness, jealousy, and quiet rage. To neighbors, they were still just a broken couple trying to co-parent, but inside the circles they once controlled, loyalties had started to slide. And someone else, someone outside the family, had started paying close attention to Thomas's every move. That attention would soon turn into something else entirely. Thomas had barely settled into his new life when word started to spread. He was seeing someone new, and in the world he moved in, one fueled by drugs, revenge, and old loyalties that mattered a lot. Because the woman he'd started seeing had history. Her ex was John Belfield, a name whispered in certain circles, linked to organised crime and heavy supply lines of Class A drugs. Not just a rival, a reasonable threat. Belfield didn't take it quietly. On the surface, he played it smart. Behind closed doors, and soon after hearing of the relationship, he began plotting. Not in anger, but in a very professional way. He wanted to hurt Thomas and take whatever cash, drugs, or valuables he could in the process. It started with a message. Belfield contacted Colleen Campbell through Instagram. Until then, they'd never spoken. But something clicked. Over the next few days, they shared 68 messages and 35 calls. Prosecutors said Belfield used her. Others said she knew exactly what she was doing. Colleen began feeding him key details: the van Thomas drove, his house number, where he'd be at specific times. A tracker was discussed, but we will talk about this in a while. To the outside world, it looked like old friends reconnecting, but police would later recover footage of Belfield and Colleen, a 25-minute meeting in her back garden, just a day before Thomas died. The plot had begun. The target had been selected. All that remained was the right moment to strike. And that moment came on the evening of July 2nd. In the days leading up to the murder, the planning intensified. June 27th, just 5 days before the attack, Belfield, Cleworth, and Stephen met at the Boat and Horses pub in Oldham. CCTV captured the trio sitting at a table. What looked like casual conversation was something else entirely. One of them moved his hand under the table, mimicking how to fit a tracker to a vehicle. Later that day, the device was fitted. It was small, discreet, and stuck beneath Thomas's van while he waited to collect his daughter from school. A quiet operation, one that let them trace his movements without ever being seen. With the tracker in place, the surveillance began. Thomas had no idea. Every trip he made, every stop, every return home, They were all logged. Colleen, prosecutors said, gave context to the data. When he'd be out, when he'd be alone, when the front door would open. On June 30th, the gang pulled up outside his house, but they aborted. Something wasn't right. It wasn't time. 2 nights later, they came back. 3 men. A Vauxhall combo van. Parked on a neighbouring drive just after 11 p.m. CCTV from the street would later show them waiting, silent inside the parked vehicle. They weren't dressed for robbery. No demands were shouted, no weapons shown until the moment they moved. The plan wasn't to break in, it was to wait, to watch, and to pounce the second Thomas opened the door. At 11:06 p.m, he did. What followed inside the house, the violence would last for nearly 2 hours. But it all began here, on a quiet street in Mossley, with a door left unlocked and 3 shadows moving fast toward it. Before we move toward the 2 hours of violence that ended Thomas Campbell's life, we need to rewind to a moment prosecutors would later use as a sign of what was coming. It happened on June 29th, just 3 days before the murder. Colleen Campbell was caught on CCTV in Ashton-under-Lyne, striding across a residential street with a claw hammer in her hand. In the footage, she moves quickly, no attempt to hide. One woman, connected to her ex's wider circle, is struck with the weapon before Colleen turns and walks away. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't random. It was personal. A flare-up in a long tangled dispute involving jealousy, reputation, and shifting alliances. At the time, police filed it as a standalone assault, but during the murder trial, it was brought back into the frame. Prosecutors argued it showed Colleen's mindset, that she wasn't just a bitter ex. She was volatile, active, and capable of direct violence. Someone who would lash out without hesitation. The hammer never made it into the murder scene, but the mentality, the readiness to escalate, to strike first, carried forward. By that stage, she'd already been in contact with John Belfield, already shared key details. Now, she was attacking people on the street in broad daylight. To the outside world, it still looked like she was grieving, a mother raising children alone. But in the shadows, she was aligning herself with a plan. And the man she once shared a life with was now in real danger. The first strike came the moment the door opened. Thomas Campbell barely had time to speak before he was pulled inside. The door slammed shut. Lights stayed off. No neighbors saw anything. For the next 2 hours, he was held in his own home, stripped, restrained, and attacked in almost total silence. What happened inside that house was brutal by any standard. Thomas suffered 61 separate injuries. He was punched, stamped on, and stabbed. At one point, boiling water was poured over his buttocks and legs, a form of punishment long associated with gang retribution. Police later described it as a prolonged, targeted assault designed to inflict pain. He was dragged from room to room, marks left on the floor with almost no chance of survival. When paramedics arrived, they found him naked except for a pair of socks. His home, once filled with luxury fittings and polished floors, had become a crime scene soaked in blood. But there were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no alarm raised, just one neighbor's doorbell cam, capturing a brief glimpse of the men as they stepped inside. Whoever had done this had known exactly how to get close and exactly when to strike. The killers took nothing of value, no cash, no jewelry, not even the designer items laid out in plain sight. This wasn't about robbery. It was about humiliation, pain, and dominance. Forensics would later confirm multiple attackers, different DNA, different shoe prints, overlapping patterns of violence. But none of them spoke a word during the assault. By the time Thomas was declared dead at the scene, the attackers were already gone. No vehicle was seen leaving, no witnesses came forward. Just a man left dead in his hallway, and a silence that would only be broken days later by someone who claimed he'd spoken from beyond the grave. 4 days after Thomas's murder, his mother answered a knock at the door. Standing outside was Campbell. She said she'd seen a psychic, claimed she'd been visited by Thomas during a séance, and that he had things to tell her. What followed was a detailed account of the attack. Colleen spoke about boiling water, facial injuries, the number of men involved. She even mimicked a cut across the cheek as she spoke. Claimed Thomas had told her everything, through the psychic. His mother listened, but something didn't sit right. Those injuries weren't public, not the boiling, not the slashes, not the number of attackers. Only detectives and killers would know what Thomas had suffered. She ended the conversation and went straight to the police. That moment became critical. Investigators checked the timeline. By then, Colleen's phone had already been flagged. Data showed contact with John Belfield on the night of the murder. Messages and calls, some exchanged just hours after Thomas was declared dead. Colleen's version, that she'd learned it all from a psychic, began to fall apart. What she claimed was spiritual turned out to be forensic. What she passed off as otherworldly insight was, in fact, the raw evidence. In court, prosecutors argued that the séance story was never about grief. It was a cover, a deflection, a way of explaining how she knew what no one else could have, because she hadn't heard it from a ghost, but from one of the men who was there. The silence didn't last long. Behind the scenes, Greater Manchester Police had already launched a full-scale investigation. They called it Operation Ravensburg, and it would uncover a network of surveillance, planning, and collusion stretching back weeks. Over 200 witnesses were interviewed. More than 3,000 exhibits were logged. CCTV was pulled from street corners, shop fronts, even neighboring houses. Hours of footage were analyzed frame by frame. They traced the Vauxhall combo van, located the pub meeting days earlier, matched times, movements, and mobile signals. Every call Colleen made to Belfield, every message, every location ping, it all began to slot into place. Footage from Colleen's own home showed her and Belfield in the garden that we discussed earlier, just two people deep in discussion, under cover of darkness. Elsewhere, the tracker told its own story, attached with care and positioned to avoid detection, logging routes in and out of Thomas's home for days. And Colleen had given context to every signal. Even after the murder, Colleen stayed in contact with Belfield. A final call came just hours after Thomas's body was found. All of it pointed to a joint plan. The first arrest came within days. Reece Stephen, 29, was picked up after forensic teams linked his DNA to a VW Caddy van believed to be used during the getaway. Officers tracked him to a Manchester address. He was arrested on suspicion of murder. Next came Stephen Cleworth, 38. He was detained in Haywood after CCTV and phone records placed him at key planning meetings, including the one at the Boat and Horses pub. His role in the early stages of the plot was enough to bring him in. Then, police turned their attention to Campbell. She was arrested at her home in Clayton, Greater Manchester. Her contact with John Belfield had drawn a clear line. Combined with what she told Thomas's mother after the séance, it was enough. Each arrest added a new layer to the investigation, but one figure remained missing. By the time the others were charged, John Belfield had disappeared. Police moved fast, raiding properties across Greater Manchester and beyond. But Belfield was already gone. No phone signal, no trace. Just whispers, a fake passport, burner phones, and help from people still loyal to him. He wasn't just another name in the case. Detectives believed he had planned every detail, the surveillance, the ambush, the method of attack. He'd chosen the men, directed the timing, even controlled the cleanup. And yet, when the arrests were made, Belfield slipped through the net. A European arrest warrant was issued. Border alerts flagged his profile. Interpol added him to their wanted list. But still, nothing. Meanwhile, back in the UK, the Crown built its case without him. Prosecutors laid out the evidence, from the tracker on Thomas's van to the phone data linking Colleen to Belfield. For a while, it looked like he might be right. But in the summer of 2023, over a year after Thomas was killed, A breakthrough came. Belfield had fled to Suriname, a small country on South America's northeast coast. He was arrested by local authorities and taken into custody under a fake name. For months, he remained locked in a cell 4,500 miles away. Then, in June 2025, John Belfield was finally returned to the UK. Greater Manchester Police confirmed his arrival. His long absence was over, and the case was no longer frozen. He now faces charges for his alleged role in planning and ordering the killing. Proceedings are expected to resume in the coming weeks, with Belfield set to stand trial alone. On July 12, 2023, at Bolton Crown Court, the trial of 3 defendants came to an end. The charges were murder, manslaughter, and conspiracy to rob. The prosecution laid out a case built on weeks of surveillance footage, phone records, and forensic analysis. They argued that this was not a burglary gone wrong. It was a calculated ambush. They told the jury about each evidence that came across while investigating, and we have already discussed. And I'm not going into those details again. The attack, they said, was carried out with military precision and with clear knowledge passed from Colleen Campbell, the toxic ex of the victim. Rhys Stephen, they said, had entered the house alongside 2 others. Doorbell footage confirmed that 3 men followed Thomas through the door. Once inside, all 3 had a direct participant in the torture leading up to the murder. In response, the defense tried to draw lines between planning and violence. Colleen claimed she believed it was a robbery, that no one intended for Thomas to be killed. Cleworth insisted he wasn't present when the murder took place. Only Rhys Stephen offered no defense at all. The jury rejected all of their claims, then returned their verdicts. Rhys Stephen, 29, was found guilty of murder and conspiracy to rob. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 37 years. Stephen Cleworth, 38, was convicted of manslaughter and conspiracy to rob. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Colleen Campbell, 38, was found guilty of manslaughter and conspiracy to rob. The judge described her as the one who set the ball rolling. She was sentenced to 13 years in prison and must serve at least 2/3 before she can be considered for release. As sentencing was delivered, one figure remained outside the courtroom. But not anymore. Soon he too will face justice. What did you make of the case and the sentences handed down? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. As for John Belfield, the case remains ongoing. A trial will determine what comes next. If you want more real UK crime stories like this, subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. There's always another case to uncover. It was near closing time. Lights low, music winding down. At a bar in West London, the final drinks were being poured. Nothing felt out of place. A few dozen people lingered near the walls and tables. Some are ready to head home, others still leaning into the night. Among them, a 21-year-old. He was relaxed and talking with friends. Then a man he didn't know walked straight over. What followed took less than 10 seconds. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, the man was already gone. This is the story of a young life that ended without warning, and how his killer became Britain's most wanted fugitive. Before we go on, I need your help. Leave a comment about the case or the way it's told. It helps this story reach more people. Josh Hanson was 21 years old. He lived with his mum in Kingsbury, northwest London, and worked as a roads planner for the local council. Known for being polite, hardworking, and close to his family, he was the kind of person who rarely went out looking for trouble. He loved his job, often started early, and was the type to make time for both his friends and his mum. His sister Brooke described him as thoughtful, someone who'd stop everything if you needed him. That Saturday night, he was doing what thousands of young people do every weekend. He was out with his girlfriend and a few mates. Nothing unusual, just a Saturday night, a quick drink, and plans for work. Shane O'Brien, on the other hand, moved in different circles. Born in West London, he was 27 at the time and already well known to police. He had links to organised crime and was considered part of a network that operated across Europe. People close to the case described him as careful, quiet and well-resourced, not flashy, but calculated. He had a daughter, kept his personal life guarded, and was known to frequent boxing gyms and nightclubs. Despite his background, he kept a low public profile. When he went out, he didn't attract attention. They didn't know each other, no connection, no shared history. Just two men in the same bar on the same night. What happened next was as fast as it was fatal. It was the early hours of Sunday, the 11th of October, 2015. The RE Bar in Eastcote, West London, was winding down for the night. Around 40 people remained, scattered across tables and the bar area. CCTV footage shows Josh Hanson arriving with his girlfriend and friends, standing near a wall inside the venue. Quiet conversation with friends. Across the room, seated with a group of his own, was Shane O'Brien, wearing his Canada Goose jacket. CCTV footage later confirmed the two men had no contact. They didn't speak. They didn't even glance at each other. O'Brien sat opposite, drinking with his group, blending in like anyone else. Staff and patrons later said nothing about him stood out. At around 1:10 a.m., O'Brien stood and made his way across the bar. He approached Josh directly, and the two exchanged brief words, something heated, though never fully detailed in any official account. The conversation lasted seconds. Then, mid-argument, O'Brien reached into the pocket of his Canada Goose jacket, pulled out a Stanley-style knife and slashed Josh across the neck and chest, one swift motion. The blade carved a 37-centimeter wound, beginning just behind Josh's ear and cutting diagonally downwards. The entire attack took less than 10 seconds. People around them froze at the time. Many didn't realize what had happened until they saw the blood. An off-duty nurse ran over and tried to stop the bleeding, but Josh collapsed quickly. He was pronounced dead shortly after paramedics arrived. O'Brien didn't run. He didn't panic. He turned and walked out through the main door as calmly as he had entered. CCTV footage caught him leaving the bar, disappearing down Field End Road. Within minutes, the bar became a crime scene. Those 40 witnesses trying to piece together what they'd seen. No one had stopped him, and no one knew where he went. Shortly after, police arrived at the scene. The bar was sealed off and forensics moved in. Field End Road was cordoned off in both directions. Officers took statements from dozens of witnesses while the forensic team worked through the blood-stained floor, shattered glasses, and CCTV footage. Within hours, detectives knew who they were looking for. But by then, Shane O'Brien was already gone. That's when the hunt began. In the hours after the murder, he didn't return to his home in Ladbroke Grove. Instead, he relied on a network, contacts well-versed in moving people and secrets. Over the next 2 days, he travelled from London to Kent. Investigators later discovered that he arrived at Biggin Hill Airport, a private airfield in southeast London. There, he boarded a privately chartered jet to the Netherlands. He used false documentation. The plane was booked under a fake identity. By the time police issued the first appeal, he was already across the channel. It was a clean exit, and a deeply organised one. This detail, a fugitive flying out of the country in a private aircraft, became one of the most heavily criticised elements of the case. From the Netherlands, his movements became harder to trace. Over the next few months, he dropped off the radar completely. He didn't use credit cards, he didn't check into hotels. Everything was cash, everything was hidden. To survive that long on the run, he clearly had serious help, but we'll get to that later. At this stage, he had slipped through the cracks. His face was on wanted posters, but no one could find him. For the police, the chase was now international. But for O'Brien, the run was just beginning. In the days after the murder, Shane O'Brien's name was added to Europol's most wanted list. British police, working with the National Crime Agency, pushed out appeals across Europe. They released updated images, circulated descriptions of his distinctive Canada Goose jacket, and initially offered £10,000, but later extended to £50,000 reward for information. But O'Brien had vanished. Detectives quickly learned he wasn't acting alone. He was being supported, financially and logistically, by organised criminal networks. Associates were providing him with safe houses, burner phones, and high-quality fake IDs. He didn't leave a trail. No bank cards or phones. Nothing traceable. Leads started to come in from across the continent. There were sightings in Germany, the Netherlands, and France. At one point, intelligence placed him in Dubai, where he was believed to be under the protection of serious organised crime contacts. But by the time local authorities followed up, he had moved again. Then came the break that nearly changed everything. In February 2017, Czech police arrested a man named Enzo Melancelli in Prague for criminal damage and assault. He had long hair, a beard, and a new back tattoo, a large owl clutching a skull designed to cover a previous mark. What Czech authorities didn't realize at the time, Melancelli was Shane O'Brien. They released him on bail, unaware they had briefly detained Britain's most wanted fugitive. His real identity was only uncovered weeks later when the images were matched and Interpol was notified. By then, he was gone again. More sightings followed, in Gibraltar, in Nice, in Prague once more. But O'Brien kept slipping through. He was careful, moved at night, stayed quiet, always a step ahead. The trail stayed warm, but never closed, until he made one mistake, and the arrest followed. While police worked across borders, Josh Hanson's family began their own search. With no justice and no answers, they refused to stay quiet. His mother, Tracy Hanson, became the driving force behind a nationwide and international campaign, not just to keep her son's name alive, but to make sure Shane O'Brien's face was seen by as many people as possible. She printed thousands of wanted posters, laminated them herself, and mailed them to supporters across the UK and abroad. She pushed O'Brien's image on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, updating followers and urging people to share. At every anniversary, she marked the date publicly, lighting candles, holding vigils, and speaking to press. 3 years after Josh's murder, she made headlines again. On what would have been his birthday, Tracy and Josh's sister Brooke completed a skydive to raise awareness. She also walked the streets of London wearing a sandwich board, not for fundraising, but simply to be seen. The board carried Josh's photo and details of the man who killed him. She stood outside train stations during rush hour, handing out flyers. Tracy later said she wasn't sure how else to get people to care. She said, too many had forgotten or never heard his name at all. Alongside her efforts, the Met Police released regular updates. They added O'Brien to Interpol's red notice list and renewed public appeals. But each time they pushed, he seemed to slip further away. Behind the scenes, the family pressed for answers. They contacted the Met Commissioner, the National Crime Agency, and anyone they believed could help. Tracy questioned how someone could flee on a private jet and stay hidden for years, and how she was expected to grieve with no justice. She wasn't just grieving a son, she was chasing a fugitive, and she refused to stop. It was March 2019, nearly 3.5 years after Josh Hanson's murder, when Shane O'Brien finally slipped up. He'd spent the past few years moving through Europe under false identities, supported by a network that helped him vanish across borders. But this time, he made an error. In Romania, O'Brien had been using the alias Enzo Melancelli, the same name he'd used during his previous arrest in Prague. Video captured him walking along a normal street when suddenly, civilian-dressed Romanian officers appeared out of nowhere. They forced him to the ground, pinned him down, and arrested him in broad daylight. Witnesses later said he offered no resistance, handcuffed and quickly bundled into a squad van. Romanian authorities worked closely with British counterparts and updated Interpol to confirm that Enzo Melancelli was indeed O'Brien. His distinctive owl and skull back tattoo, his altered appearance, and fingerprints all matched following the arrest. Extradition procedures began immediately. This time, there was no bail, no early release. He was held under armed guards, escorted onto a flight back to the UK, and landed at Heathrow in the early morning, where he appeared before a magistrate's court for the first time since re-entering Britain. For Josh's family, the news came quickly. After endless days of silence, appeals, and near misses, Shane O'Brien had finally been found. But the fight wasn't over. Now came the legal battle to bring him home. Shane O'Brien was flown back to the UK in April 2019. He appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court within hours of landing and was charged with the murder of Josh Hanson. The trial began later that year at the Old Bailey. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented clear CCTV footage showing the moment of the attack, from the way O'Brien approached Josh to the slashing motion and his calm exit. There was no dispute about who had done it. The focus was on motive and whether the killing was premeditated. O'Brien claimed it was a moment of madness, that he hadn't planned it, but the jury heard how he'd brought the knife into the bar, how he had no known relationship with Josh, and how he'd fled the country just hours after the murder, using fake documents and criminal contacts. Prosecutors described it as an unprovoked and calculated killing, carried out in public, in a room full of witnesses, with no hesitation. The court also heard how O'Brien had spent years hiding under false names, changing his appearance and relying on an international network to stay hidden. He had support, he had resources, and he showed no signs of giving himself up. After a short deliberation, the jury found him guilty of murder. In October 2019, Shane O'Brien was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 26 years. The judge described the attack as grotesque and savage, and O'Brien had shown no remorse. For Josh Hanson's family, it was the justice they had waited more than 4 years to see. The man who took Josh's life in under 10 seconds would now spend decades behind bars. What do you make of the sentence? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more real UK crime stories told like this, subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. There's always another case to uncover. It started with a dog walk. It was a cold December morning when a dog walker came across something unusual near Woodland, a narrow footpath outside West Calder. At first, it looked like part of an animal, weathered bones sticking through the earth. But as police arrived and began the search, it became clear this was something else. So police sealed off the area. Forensics moved in, and what they found wasn't a full body, just fragments. A skull, part of a spine, no clothing, no personal effects, no immediate way to know who it was or what had happened. Whoever it was had been gone for months. For weeks, forensic teams worked through the evidence. And then, quietly, a name emerged. A name that hadn't been spoken in months. Not since he vanished from Glasgow without a trace. Martin Hamilton, a man feared across 2 cities, linked to torture, rape, extortion, and some of the most disturbing crimes ever uncovered in Scotland's underworld. This is the story of how he built that empire, and how it ended in a shallow grave. Martin Hamilton grew up in Maryhill, northwest Glasgow, just streets from the Cranston Hill police station. But even as a child, the law was never a threat. Not to him. Other school kids knew to stay clear. If Hamilton got on the bus, the smart ones got off. They called him unpredictable, some called him sadistic, but most just called him dangerous. By the age of 17, he was already carrying weapons. In 1984, he was jailed for assault and intent to cause serious injury. He was 5'5", overweight, fast-talking and always on edge. But people learned quickly. Never mistake him for weak. He didn't run with crews, he didn't pledge loyalty. Martin Hamilton operated alone, moving in and out of Glasgow's criminal circles without allegiance. Drugs, intimidation, robbery. He touched all of it. But what set him apart wasn't ambition. It was cruelty. Hamilton had a pattern. He targeted the vulnerable, often young men trapped in addiction or debt. He used his sexuality as a weapon, raping, humiliating, and dominating. He hated being labeled, but he used fear and confusion to control his victims. And he made sure they couldn't talk. By the early 1990s, he'd survived 2 shootings outside his own home. The press gave him a name that stuck, Scotland's most hated man, and he didn't correct them. In 1992, he was jailed again, this time for a violent attempted robbery of a building society. Armed with knives and an imitation gun, Hamilton and 3 others lay in wait for staff. They didn't know the police were tipped off. The job collapsed in minutes. The courts knew who he was, but they didn't know how to stop him, because Hamilton had figured something out. If you scare your victims badly enough, you never face justice. And so far, it was working. By the late 1990s, Hamilton was wearing out his welcome in Glasgow. He'd fallen out with major underworld figures, including Arthur Thompson, one of the city's most powerful names. A botched contract killing, taken and never delivered, had burned the last bridge. So he moved east. Edinburgh's west side was nothing like Glasgow. Fewer major players and more fractured networks. Ideal for someone like Hamilton, violent, autonomous, and used to filling a vacuum. He settled into Broomhouse, Wester Hailes, and Sighthill, and then he went to work. Police in Edinburgh didn't know what they were dealing with. Their counterparts in Glasgow knew Hamilton well, but they hadn't warned them in time. What followed was a wave of violence Edinburgh hadn't seen in years. Hamilton didn't just deal drugs, he took over turf by force. He gave teenage dealers heroin and ecstasy, then demanded daily payments. When they failed, he made examples. One boy had his finger cut off. Another nearly lost an eye to a teaspoon. Reports began surfacing of young men being beaten, scolded, and sexually assaulted, sometimes both. Local pub landlords were next. One admitted paying £30,000 just to keep Hamilton away. Another tried to do business with him and ended up in a ditch, shot in the head. The police finally responded. A 24/7 surveillance unit was launched. They tracked his movements, logged his meetings, and waited for a mistake. But even then, they couldn't act. Witnesses wouldn't speak. Victims were vanishing. Hamilton's hold on the community was growing stronger by the day. In just months, he'd turned scattered supply lines into a personal empire. Not with strategy, not with diplomacy, but with fear. And yet, even with police watching, even with enemies building, Hamilton wasn't finished. He wanted more, and he was about to go too far. Hamilton thrived in the silence. Fear kept victims quiet. For years, that was enough. The police knew what he was doing. They had statements, then retractions, complaints, then silence. Again and again, the pattern held: abduction, torture, and rape. But every time it neared court, witnesses vanished or withdrew. Then came the case that broke through. A teenage couple, boyfriend and girlfriend, both 18, had come to a Glasgow flat to collect drugs. What followed was a 10-hour ordeal. They were beaten until they couldn't stand, then tied up and forced to strip. Their cheeks were pierced with a blade, then boiling water was poured over their skin. To avoid blood on the carpets, Hamilton made them stand in a bathtub. He shouted instructions while others followed them out. When the girl screamed back, he hit her and laughed. But this time, his victim survived, and more importantly, they talked. The court knew the risks. So, the trial was moved to Inverness, 200 miles from Glasgow. No media coverage, no open records. The couple was placed under one of the highest witness protection regimes ever seen in Scotland. Their testimony changed everything. Other victims, addicts, dealers, landlords, began coming forward. Slowly and carefully. The stories were consistent. Scars in the same places. Threats repeated word for word. One man said he was tortured with pliers. Another described being set on fire. A third spoke of being sodomized at knife point, then told if he talked, his family would disappear. This wasn't just enforcement, this was sadism, and it had been going on for years. But for the first time, prosecutors had enough, and eventually charges were built. Files were locked down, the courts were ready. Hamilton's empire had always relied on silence. Now it was beginning to crack. Hamilton arrived at court under heavily armed escort. The trial took place at the High Court in Inverness, deliberately chosen to avoid the risk as we discussed earlier. And this time, the jury heard everything. The trial lasted 6 weeks. For the first time, the High Court heard the wider scale of Hamilton's violence laid out as a pattern, not isolated acts. Prosecutors drew on years of hidden files and newly cooperative witnesses, many of whom had never spoken before. Statements described a methodical cycle: drugs supplied, debts enforced, and punishments carried out with terrifying consistency. What had once been whispered between addicts and dealers was now laid bare, not as rumor, but as evidence. In November 2000, he was found guilty of 11 charges, including drug dealing, abduction, assault, and torture. For other charges, including multiple sexual offenses, the jury could not agree, but it didn't matter. The weight of what stuck was enough. Lord Kingarth handed down a life sentence with a minimum of 9 years. He described Hamilton as a man who took sadistic pleasure in the infliction of pain and the inspiration of real terror. The verdict closed one chapter, but not the whole book. Hamilton was handed a life sentence with a minimum of 9 years. It was the longest term he'd faced, and the first time the courts had held him properly to account, but few believed it would end there. Behind the scenes, officers already knew what lay ahead. He wasn't a man who faded quietly. Even in a cell, Hamilton wouldn't give up control. There was relief, yes, but not celebration. Not just because of the crimes that hadn't stuck. Not just because he'd escaped justice so many times before, but because everyone watching knew the truth. Prison wouldn't be the end of Martin Hamilton. It would simply give him new walls to manipulate. At HMP Shotts, he kept his distance from the main population, not because he feared violence, but because most inmates feared him. Guards reportedly used his name as a threat: step out of line, and you'd end up in a cell next to Hamilton. He wasn't just feared for his past, he was feared for what he was still doing inside. Hamilton volunteered as a listener, a scheme where older inmates offered support to vulnerable prisoners. It was supposed to be a safeguard for those at risk of self-harm or suicide. Instead, it gave him access. Multiple accounts later described how he used those sessions to isolate young offenders. One man, who had been on suicide watch, said Hamilton raped him twice. Once inside prison, once during a coerced meeting on day release. Too traumatized to report it at the time, he came forward years later, only after learning Hamilton might face fresh charges. Others remained silent. He didn't run gangs, he didn't work up through a hierarchy. Hamilton operated alone, and inside prison, that made him harder to control. Even after conviction, even behind bars, the abuse continued. But in 2014, that reckoning never came. Because before the court could call him back, Martin Hamilton was gone. In September 2014, Martin Hamilton was released from HMP Shotts. He'd served the minimum term of his life sentence and was freed on license. To the system, it was a controlled release. But to those who knew him, it was a warning sign. Conditions were strict. Any breach would return him to custody. But within months, Hamilton began slipping back into the life he was meant to leave behind. He didn't keep a low profile. He returned to familiar routines, reconnecting with underworld contacts, moving through towns west of Edinburgh, and reasserting control where he could. He was often seen around Blackburn and Harthill, small towns with fractured drug scenes and little organised resistance. Police believe he was re-establishing himself as a collector, a role that gave him leverage without drawing direct attention. One job in particular stood out. A dealer had been injured in a motorbike crash and hospitalised. Hamilton was asked to step in and manage his customer debts, essentially taking over the tick book for cocaine transactions. It should have been straightforward. Collect what was owed, pass the £40,000 to the Liverpool crew behind the supply line. But the money disappeared. Sources said Hamilton kept it. Some claimed he never intended to hand it over. Others believed he was stalling, trying to use the cash to restart his own operations. Either way, the result was the same. He crossed people with reach, money, and a reputation for making examples. Meanwhile, he began moving more openly again. There were unconfirmed sightings in Glasgow and reports of him making calls, arranging pickups, revisiting old debts. He wasn't just slipping back into crime, he was making himself visible and vulnerable. By April 2015, he'd vanished. He was due to appear at Glasgow Sheriff Court for breaching his licence. He didn't show. A warrant was issued. Police launched a national appeal calling him potentially dangerous and warning the public not to approach. Crime Stoppers offered a £2,000 reward. BBC's Crime Watch aired his face. But Hamilton was already gone. No bank activity, no phone records. Not a single confirmed sighting after the 16th of April, when he was last seen around Great Western Road, Glasgow. For someone as feared as Hamilton, that wasn't a risk. It was a challenge. But this time, the threat didn't come from addicts or rivals in Scotland. It came from those above him, the ones who expected that money back. Now we are back to the very first point from where we started. On 17th December 2015, a dog walker veered off a woodland path near West Calder. Just past the B7015, close to the edge of the Five Sisters Business Park, they saw a skull, a portion of spine. Nothing else, as we discussed it earlier. It was clear this wasn't a recent death. Whoever had buried him had made sure of that. Over the following days, specialists worked the site. Pathologists confirmed the remains were human. DNA tests followed. Quietly, without a press conference or announcement, a name emerged. Martin Hamilton. He'd been missing for 8 months. Now he was back, buried in a shallow grave, hidden in the cold soil of West Lothian. Detectives didn't call it a murder, not at first. Officially, it was unexplained. But off the record, they knew. The injuries were clear. Blunt force trauma, sharp force damage to the skull, and a bullet to the head, according to intelligence sources. This wasn't random. This was an execution. There was no sign of his clothes, no trace of a struggle, just carefully chosen isolation. A location few people would stumble across, unless they knew it. Investigators began reconstructing his last known movements. He was last seen on the 16th of April 2015 around lunchtime, near Great Western Road in Glasgow. What happened after that remains unknown, but police believed he was lured out, not abducted on the street, but drawn into something he thought he could control. The main suspect emerged early, James Farrelly, 53, a Liverpudlian with known ties to West Lothian and a history of drug-related violence. He'd been living just miles from where Hamilton's remains were discovered, close enough to raise questions, but not so close as to seem careless. But it wasn't geography alone that led police to him. Investigators had received intelligence from underworld sources, whispers that Hamilton had ripped off a Liverpool-based crew for £40,000, and that Farrelly had been the one told to deal with it. Forensic searches of nearby properties, phone data, and movement records began to narrow the circle. When Farrelly's name surfaced again, links to the same drug circles Hamilton had tried to re-enter, police moved in. He was charged with Hamilton's murder, accused of shooting him, then inflicting sharp and blunt force trauma to destroy the evidence. He was also charged with attempting to defeat the ends of justice by burying the body, and with Class A drug offences tied to cocaine and heroin supply. But he never stood trial. Diagnosed with terminal cancer shortly after his arrest, Farrelly was released from custody in early 2017. He died weeks later, and with him, the last direct line of accountability. Hamilton's funeral was delayed for over 8 months while investigators worked the case. When it finally took place, only a handful attended. The man once feared in 2 cities left quietly, with no public eulogy, no headlines. No convictions followed, no final justice arrived. Martin Hamilton, the Black Hill butcher, had spent a lifetime building power through fear. In the end, it made him untouchable, until someone decided to prove he wasn't. What do you make of this case? No trial, no conviction, just a body in the woods, and a suspect who died before he could face court. Do you think this was the only ending possible for a man like Martin Hamilton? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more real stories from the UK underworld, subscribe, turn on notifications, and we'll see you next time. There's always another case to uncover,